What am I playing? Shining in the Darkness. Damn it. Sega's Shining series has always fascinated me because it's one of those series that really branched out and experimented with its identity. Sure, every game in the series is some sort of flavor of RPG, some more so than others, but I can't really think of a series outside of it that has dabbled in so many different genres without making them spin-offs or separate from the main series. Sure, Final Fantasy sort of comes close with its slow transition away from more traditional turn-based combat in favor of going in a more action-oriented direction, but even then, it still has numbered sequels, and most of the games outside of that are clearly labeled as spin-offs. With the Shining series though, well, it doesn't really have a main series. There are some sub-series with multiple games that share the same name and maybe a numbered sequel here or there, but almost none of the games are directly related to one another beyond the fact that they have Shining in the title. And for years, I was always under the impression that this series started with the title Shining Force, which I sort of assumed was trying to be Sega's answer to the Fire Emblem series. But then years later, a forgotten memory of another Shining game came back into my mind. The one that came out before the Force games, and one that I never associated with the tactical RPGs because it was an entirely different genre. That game was Shining in the Darkness. Allegedly made on the absolute smallest budget that Sega was willing to allocate to contracted developers at the time, most of the work was done by a single person, Hiroyuki Takahashi, who handled almost everything on the game apart from graphics and programming. Takahashi would go on to work on several games in the Shining series after this, but here in these humble beginnings, I'm happy to say, you don't really feel those budget constraints. I mean, sure, there are some obvious cut corners here and there, but for a 16-bit dungeon crawler, Shining in the Darkness holds up surprisingly well. The story is pretty basic here. You play as Merrick, son of the knight Mortred, and are summoned by King Drake to be told that the Princess Jessa has disappeared, around the same time as your father has. As such, you are tasked with finding them both, only to be told by the sudden appearance of the evil Dark Soul that he has kidnapped Jessa and moved her into the labyrinth. After an initial investigation of the labyrinth, Merrick is joined by his two best friends and town troublemakers, Pyra the Elven Mage and Milo the Priest in Training. With a party formed and a goal in mind, you set off to defeat the 4 trials of the labyrinth, enter the labyrinth proper, and defeat Dark Soul at its lowest level. Yeah, the plot is mostly there as an excuse to go on a dungeon-crawling adventure. It's nothing you haven't heard before, but where it makes up for this is in its personality and presentation. While the characters aren't super deep or nuanced, they do have some fun personalities, and I absolutely love the character designs. I'm actually a little upset that you don't get to see Pyra and Milo much once they end up joining your party, because they do leave a bit of a strong impression when you first meet them. Unfortunately, after joining your party, except for 1 or 2 small instances much later on in the game, they basically become heroic mutes along with your main character. Still, while the dialogue from the rest of the townsfolk doesn't give them much personality, someone definitely had fun drawing them, especially the shopkeepers. I love how whenever you're in their shop and they have to pull up your character inventories, the shopkeeper just looks annoyed to be shoved to the side in their own store. It's great. And while they might not have a huge amount of stuff to say about themselves, talking to folks at the tavern can sometimes give you some interesting bits of info, even if it's just for some minor world building. A lot of what we're told about characters is a little bit more tell rather than show, but I think this is an example of how that style can work. Normally we push show don't tell as the only way to deliver information in stories, but in a limited capacity like this, telling us about characters works fine, especially if we get at least one example to corroborate what we're told. Like here, we're told about how Pyra and Milo aren't really looked at very fondly by the townsfolk, and a little while later, right after Pyra joins us, she demonstrates this by intentionally casting a slow spell on a mercenary who's on his way into the labyrinth, merely because she accidentally bumped into him, which does show her as a bit of a petty brat, and helps corroborate what we've already been told about her. The people at the palace are a little less interesting, but you do have to return there periodically to move the plot along, and they'll trigger plot-important events to help you move deeper into the labyrinth. You can also get some hints and information on upcoming floors or things that you should be looking for, and while it never gets too terribly detailed, the game is generally pretty good about pointing you in the direction you should go without telling you exactly where you need to look. It's straightforward, and for the most part, so long as you are diligent about searching the labyrinth, you probably won't have too many issues most of the time. There are only 3 places on the world map to visit. The palace, where you'll go when you need to progress the plot, the village, where you can rest up at the tavern, save at the shrine, and buy weapons, armor, and items, and the labyrinth itself, where you'll be spending most of your playtime. The game is played entirely from a first-person perspective while in the labyrinth, and you have to navigate the winding, always similar halls of the maze to find hidden treasures, find your way to different caves, and pass the trials by making your way to the end of each of them. And this is where most players who aren't really familiar with older examples of this sort of game might find things a little bit on the frustrating side. While the map is not randomly generated, it's always the same dungeon every time, you are given no maps of the dungeon itself. Now you can find a couple of map items at certain points, but those maps are literally only there to show you a very specific part of that specific floor to help you avoid some very deviously laid out traps. Other than that, the only way to see what's not directly in front of you is either have Pyra cast a view spell or use a wisdom seed, which will allow you to see a very limited view of the section of the labyrinth around you, but it will only show you spaces that you've stepped over before and won't show you things like traps or obstacles. And make no mistake, this labyrinth is a proper labyrinth. If you don't have something to help you keep track of your location, you are going to get lost. And getting lost in a game like this is just the absolute worst feeling ever, especially when you start getting into fights. The fights are where you start to notice the somewhat limited budget, and none of the characters really have any animation. It's less noticeable in town, but in combat, where you'll be spending a good amount of your time, I can't help but notice that the enemies just sort of jitter around to make it seem like they're moving and shuffling about. And when they attack or cast a spell, they just flip back and forth a few times. I actually find that pretty adorable. Plus, the screams the enemies give off, they're all the same scream, just pitched up or down, or slowed down or sped up depending on the size of the enemy, which I think is pretty cute too. It's a good example of reusing assets creatively to make up for a really low budget. And in keeping with the designs of the NPCs, most of the monsters are just really well designed too. I mean, this game manages to make even the most basic of slimes look at least somewhat interesting, which I always think is a plus. Of course, you'll be seeing that same design a lot, because in addition to the limited animation, there are a lot of recolors in this game. Over the course of the first few areas of the game, you're going to run into 4 different flavors of these jelly enemies. And look, there's nothing wrong with this in game design. Reusing assets allows for teams with lower budgets or time crunches to reuse what they have to help fill out the game. But it is a bit weird to have so many different recolors of a single enemy type show up so close to one another. Again, I don't think this is a bad thing, but it's very odd to me to see so many variations so close together, when color variations generally take a while to start appearing in most other RPGs. Combat in this game is fairly interesting. You only have 3 characters, and each of them fill specific uses. Your main character, Merrick, is actually the least interesting of the 3. In combat, he can hit things with his sword. That's it. He gains no spells, and apart from using items, there is no variation to his strategy. Hell, he can't even guard, because as the leader of the party, his guard command is switched out for flee. You'd think that'd make him the tank of the party, but he's actually more of a glass cannon. He has the highest attack and hit point growths of the 3 characters, but everything else is below average. So he'll take more damage from almost everything, and his speed is so abysmal that he's pretty much guaranteed to go last in any fight without having his speed buffed, or the monsters debuffed. However, it does even out a bit considering that he gets access to some of the best equipment in the game and has the widest variety to choose from. Milo, by contrast, is a bit of a weird beast. Going by growths, he is statistically the best of all three characters, but he grows the slowest out of all three of them, and has a lot less variety in his equipment. As such, he's a character that's actually pretty decent at any sort of role you want to stick him in. He can tank pretty good, he can cause a good bit of damage both physically and magically, and the later levels of his attack spells are on par with Pyra's elemental abilities. However, his main role will be as the party's healer. He learns the most powerful forms of heal spells, he learns Revive, he learns Detox to get rid of poison and paralysis and so forth, and that's where his specialty lies. He also learns a lot of the buff spells as well, like Quick and Boost. He also gets a unique type of weapon that only he can wield, flails, which allow him to attack twice in a single round, which is pretty cool. And then there's Pyra, who you would think would be the typical squishy wizard, but actually no. Pyra not only grows quickly, she actually gets a good amount of defense to counterbalance the fact that she's got the fewest options when it comes to equipment. Other than that, she's a fairly typical mage with lower regular attack and high magic, gaining access to tons of powerful magic spells, mostly elemental in nature. But she also has all of the debuff spells as well, Sleep and Slow being two of the most useful in the game. She also gets a not as powerful version of the heal spell, so she can also act as a backup healer if you really need it. She also gets access to whips as a unique weapon, and while her attack stat might not be super high, whips allow her to hit an entire group of enemies with one attack, and considering you can fight upwards of 10 enemies, yes, 10, at once, by the time you hit the halfway mark of the game, having the ability to hit multiple enemies without sacrificing magic points is a godsend. Fun fact, Pyra also has the only cursed weapon in the game that's worth using. Yeah, in this game you can find and even craft cursed weapons and armor for your characters, which have amazing stat boosts, like the Dark Helmet, which gives Merrick the highest helmet defense in the game, but at the cost of a curse, which adds a drawback to the weapon or armor that is specific to that piece of equipment. The Dark Helmet, for example, causes permanent blindness, so while Merrick is more protected while wearing it, your accuracy goes to crap, meaning he can't do the one thing he's actually good at in this game, hitting things really hard with his sword. Pyra, though, she gets a weapon called the Hex Whip, which is cursed, yes, but has the highest attack stat for her weapons in the game, and retains the whip's unique ability to hit every enemy in a group, at the cost of a 30% chance of getting tangled up in it after she attacks. But because the entanglement only happens after you use the weapon, it isn't permanent, though it can last up to 3 turns if you're unlucky. And it only happens sometimes when she uses her basic attack. So you can still safely have her using spells without worrying about it, and the amount of damage she can cause with that whip usually outweighs the risks of getting tangled by it, especially early on in the game. Usually. I really wouldn't recommend chancing it during fights with bosses or elite enemies. From there, it's fairly standard fare. You attack your opponents with physical attacks or spells until they die, you use buffs, debuffs, and heals to keep yourself safe and healthy, you earn gold and experience with every win and use that to grow stronger over the course of the game. And there's not a huge amount to set this game apart from other RPG combat systems. Except for maybe the fact that, man, these battles can drag sometimes. This isn't something that is a problem all the time due to the random nature of encounters, but sometimes, man, do you feel these battles drag on. Quite often, there's no quick way to resolve battles, especially when you reach the point where you're fighting so many opponents at once. Sure, you might be able to end it with a single spell or move sometimes if you're strong enough, but you have to let the text play out for every single monster that gets hit, so even the quicker battles in later areas feel like they can take forever. And in most situations, when you're not able to finish a fight that quickly, good lord, it can feel like a chore sometimes, and God help you when you start running into enemies that can paralyze, entangle, or put you to sleep. None of those are permanent, but every time one of your team members is incapacitated, even if temporarily, you feel it. Ordinarily, longer battles don't really bother me that much. I mean, hell, tactical RPGs are my favorite genre of games, period, and you know those guys can move at a snail's pace. But when it comes to Shining in the Darkness, the longer battles coupled with the rather atrocious encounter rate can make the game feel needlessly frustrating at times. Seriously, there are times when it feels like I get into another battle after taking a single step forward after completing the previous one, and it happens multiple times in a row. It can even be disorienting at times, like I lose my spatial awareness and forget where I am in the labyrinth, even with a map, because it took me so long to get down a particular hallway. But the reason why this isn't a deal breaker, at least in my opinion, is because it doesn't happen all the time. But it happens just often enough to make itself a problem, though not a massive one. Sometimes you hit a string of bad luck and just get railed by battle after battle after battle and just want a couple of seconds to catch your breath. Other times you can have huge swaths of time where you're just walking around and no one bothers you for a couple dozen steps or so. And does that feel weird when it happens? Since by the time I started running into that, I was sort of trained to start expecting fights every few steps or so. It was just kinda nice to relax and zone out, taking in the never-changing walls and floors of the world around you, just enjoying the constant beat of marching music in the background, thinking about whether or not you left the stove on before you started recording and, oh yeah, here they come again, break's over. While most of the time there are situations where the enemies just sort of pop out of nowhere, one thing that I really do like about this game is that certain environments have bearings on potentially uncommon encounters happening, which can cause a bit of excitement and dread. Let's take for example the very first boss encounter that you have in the game, the Kaiser Crab. This is how it appears when you reach the designated spot where you fight it. Pretty cool, right? But from that point onwards, on the first floor of the labyrinth, you can potentially run into the Kaiser Crab as a regular encounter. But every time he appears, he always peeks around the left corner, meaning he will only appear when you approach left-leaning passages. These puddles start out as just little neat aesthetics that you run into now and then to break up the monotony of the never-changing labyrinth walls. But once you reach a certain point, there's a chance that walking over one will cause a tough water-based monster to spawn, often armed with powerful freeze magic and able to attack twice. Walking down a long hallway, you have a chance of having a giant iron ball enemy roll down towards you and block your path. You can see holes in the ceiling, marking places where you'll fall down from the upper level, but sometimes, when passing underneath it, these headhunter enemies will descend from a rope and attack you. While some of these battles are scripted to happen at certain points, most of them are just like any other fight. They're fights that have a random chance of triggering when you approach certain environments in the labyrinth, which can make some of these encounters very tense, especially when you start running into really tough variants of these enemies. The game has a really interesting difficulty curve, I find. When you first start out, alone with your only real skill being to hit stuff hard, the game can feel very challenging, but after you reach the point where Milo and Pyra join you and you've worked up enough coin to upgrade everyone's equipment, and have taken some time to get your companions up to a decent level, you might actually start to outpace the enemies in terms of the damage they can deal. Seriously, I got to a point where most enemies were only doing 1 or 2 damage to me, barring the odd spellcaster here and there. But those enemies were so few and far between, and they still didn't do a troubling amount of damage to most of my characters, so I was actually worried that the game had made itself too easy, and the only real challenge was going to be navigating the labyrinth. But then I hit the 4th and final trial, the Cave of Wisdom, and whoop boy, did the game make it clear it wasn't playing with me anymore. The cave is long and winding, full of massive sections filled with pitfall traps that force you to backtrack a good distance, huge groups of enemies that are a massive step up in terms of the damage they can do, and plenty of monsters equipped with really dangerous spells. By this point, I had my characters equipped with most of the best equipment I could buy at this point in the game, and so I was at a point where I couldn't rely on just purchasing better equipment to offset the more difficult enemies, something that would continue for pretty much the rest of the game. After you pass the last trial, you do gain access to one new shop, the Trader's Tent. He sells pretty powerful stuff, and you can also craft your mithril or cursed weapons and armor, provided you can give him some mithril ore or a dark block, respectively. And you have a small fortune to spend, but even then, the boosts you get from the equipment he sells aren't going to make the game nearly as easy as it was before. It does increase your survivability somewhat, especially the mithril armor, which has the added benefit of making you immune to instant kill spells. Fuck off, Reapers! But at this point in the game, it's mostly your overall level that's going to determine how effective you are. You can find better equipment, but it's scattered throughout the upper floors of the labyrinth, most of it behind obstacles, down side paths, or inaccessible until you get certain items, meaning that, with the exception of the beginning of the game, this is the point where just grinding out experience and gold does become a bit of a necessity, though thankfully the game is not obnoxious about the time that it takes. But it can get a little bit tiring when you're going to be looking at the same thing for a very long time, and that is another reflection of the game's limited budget. While you do get a break from the labyrinth whenever you go back to town or the castle, those places are pretty small, and you're in and out of them pretty fast, and then it's back to the labyrinth. But there's not a lot of visual variety here, and I mean, it's an older dungeon crawler, so it probably is a lot to expect something super interesting or complex, and it does lend well to the game's motif of making you feel like a rat in a maze, as the lack of constant, discernible differences in the dungeon's layout can make it very easy to lose your way. You can memorize your way around with practice, but it sure isn't easy. But that doesn't change the fact that the repetitive nature of the look of the labyrinth can also feel pretty draining, especially when combined with the high encounter rate. The most unique look that the labyrinth gets is in the trial caves, but that starts to wear thin after a bit because all 4 of the caves share the same look between them. And when you do finally get past all of the trials and get up to the 2nd floor of the labyrinth and beyond, it looks exactly like the 1st floor of the labyrinth, but it's blue. Each of the floors above the first merely changes the color of the walls in order to differentiate themselves from each other, and while the shifting color does help to break up the monotony a little bit, I'd say what helps a lot more is the sudden shift in music. Oh yeah, I guess I should comment on the soundtrack as a whole, yeah? It's good, I like it. It's simple, and the amount of tracks is pretty small, but man do they cover their bases with what they have. I particularly like the town music. It's so jaunty and fun. What's interesting though is that they use it in a bit of a diegetic way. Like, as you're cycling around the different shops in town, the music will actually get a little bit softer as you move away from the tavern, and get louder when the tavern's in view. And of course, the music gets much louder when you actually go into the tavern. This is, at least from what I saw, the only time they do something like this with the soundtrack, and I really like it. But the big standout when it comes to the soundtrack is the immense feeling of foreboding I got when I first got to the 2nd level of the labyrinth. For context, for the entire time you're wandering around the 1st level of the labyrinth and the 4 trial caves, which makes up a good, I'd say 40 to even 50% of the game, you're hearing the same song. It's a bit on the longer side compared to other tracks in the game, but I think it's a pretty good song. It's got sort of a marching vibe to it, but with a touch of minor foreboding to it that makes you feel like you're definitely walking into a place you aren't exactly supposed to be. It's effective, even if the amount that you hear it does sort of wear it out. However, when you finally unlock access to the rest of the labyrinth and take that teleporter up to the 2nd floor, for the first time since exploring this place, the music changes. It becomes more eerie and foreboding, and after hearing the same marching beat so much and so often, it kinda catches you off guard. It's weirdly effective in that way, even if, like the original tune, you might start to get a bit sick of it after hearing it for the next 4 levels of the labyrinth. The rest of the soundtrack is good and does its job well, enhancing the mood of whatever situation you're in, especially the battle music, which makes reappearances in the Shining Force games that would come out afterwards. It's a great frantic track, as are the special battle themes that basically only show up for a few special encounters near the end of the game. Weirdly, it's the shorter interstitial tracks that I tend to remember the most beyond the ones I've already mentioned. Like this lovely piece that plays during moments when you find yourself on the outside of the labyrinth. Legitimately beautiful. The sound design overall seems to lack a lot of that Genesis twang, and while it's not super layered or anything, the sounds in this game are also pretty great. I've already mentioned the rather charming fact that all of the monsters in the game essentially have the same sort of roar or scream, just pitched up or down, but the menu sounds, weird as it may seem, really stick out to me. They do their job well, and it's strange that the menu sounds out of everything are the sounds I immediately associate with this game above everything else, but there's just something so satisfying about moving your cursor around an icon-based menu and clicking on it and getting that really satisfying ping sound. It's nice. I suppose the only other big thing to talk about is the only other real annoying thing about this game that kind of rubs me the wrong way, and that's its inventory management system. Dungeon crawlers are kind of infamous for the way they handle inventory, intentionally limiting what the player can carry, and this game isn't really that much different in that regard, but it does take it in some weird directions. First off, each character can hold 8 items total, and you don't have any way of storing extra, so if you're carrying 24 items, you can't get any more. But the thing is, weapons and armor take up inventory space, even when equipped, and each character can have a weapon, a chest covering, a shield, and a helmet or hat. And since you'll want to have everyone to be as well equipped as possible, well, that cuts your total inventory in half. But then there's the fact that there are a lot of key items that you have to keep on your person in order to progress through certain sections, like the Dwarven Key, the Rune Key, the Cell Key, the Orb of Truth. You need these at various points to get past certain obstacles or open certain doors, and each of them take up an inventory slot. Oh, and then there are also weapons and items that you can use while in combat from your inventory to cast certain spells or make certain effects, like the Magic Ring, which is one of the only ways in the game to reliably restore magic points, which, again, is real important later on when you're going to have to use high-level spells over and over again to keep yourself alive. And of course, you're always going to want to have at least one angel feather on you at all times in case you need to make a quick getaway, because you can't always rely on your characters having enough magic points to, say, cast egress to quickly get out of the dungeon. So yeah, the inventory in this game can be a bit frustrating, though thankfully you don't often stumble across big piles of loot. The treasure in the labyrinth is pretty well spaced out to prevent you from overloading yourself, and to help with a limited inventory, this game has something that I have yet to see in any other game. You can sell progression-important items without screwing yourself over. Yeah, I was surprised too. But there are points where you just don't need to keep carrying around certain items, and you can sell them to the various shops in town. The shopkeepers will even comment on the fact that you're bringing them unique or interesting items, and they'll do the same with rare or one-of-a-kind weapons and armor that you bring to them too. And when you sell them a unique or unusual item, it goes into the deals section of the menu of the person you'd expect to purchase the item from. Weapons go to the weapon dealer, armor to the armorer. Items like keys go to the alchemist, and so forth. Of course, if you want these things back, you'll have to pay more than what you sold them for, but in general, the difference is not huge, and in the case of keys, they can be bought back for a pittance. This is honestly a really unique way to keep your inventory from feeling flooded, and I do appreciate the option. It might have been better to just institute something like a vault or bank system or something along those lines, where you could just store items or gear you wanted to keep but didn't want to sell, but still, this is a pretty good way to solve a limited inventory problem. So yeah, I guess we're gonna take some time to talk about that ending now. If anyone cares, I'll have a spoiler marker right here if you want to avoid being spoiled on a Sega Genesis dungeon crawler from 1991. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go and take a quick look at that ending. So after you complete all the trials and return to the castle, you find out that Melvin, the magician hanging around inside the castle, is now missing. That's pretty suspicious on its own, but not long afterward, after you've visited the second floor, you meet this charming fellow in the castle, Zarn, who will flat out tell you that Melvin used to be his apprentice before turning to the dark side, and that he turned into Dark Soul, looking for more power. For such a simple story, I will say the game does a good job with surprising and interesting presentation, like what happens right after this, where you actually confront Melvin in the tavern, where he reveals himself officially and even taunts you to come find him in the labyrinth. From there, you need to get through the rest of the labyrinth, find Princess Jessa, and also find the 4 pieces of the Arms of Light, which you actually need in order to get into Dark Soul's inner sanctum. After all of that, you confront Dark Soul and fight him, and, well, he's actually not that big of a threat, really. Like, yeah, he can hit hard, but at this point, the regular mobs are actually more dangerous, especially if you're skittish about using magic. And so long as you use your spells wisely, especially your Heal 4 spell, which is expensive but heals everyone back to full health, you can actually take down both of his forms in pretty short order. After that, we do get one more pleasant surprise, where you can walk around town and visit all of the shops and buildings one more time, and talk to all of the different characters there, who will all congratulate you, except for the trader, who's mysteriously absent, and the weapon and armor shops, who are both out of business now that you've brought peace to the land. Way to make me feel bad for saving everyone's lives, you jerks. After that, all you have to do is go back to the castle one more time, speak to everyone one more time for some more congratulation messages, before talking to the king and officially being made the first true knight of the realm. Pyra decides to leave with Zarn to become his apprentice, and Milo is officially named the main character's chief counsel. After the game ends, the wizard who's there to greet you whenever you boot up the game thanks you for going on the adventure, the credits roll, and then the end. So yeah, that was Shining in the Darkness. It has definitely aged a fair bit. Any RPG from this time is going to be showing a lot of age, but if you're a fan of RPGs or dungeon crawlers, there's a lot of charm to this one. You're not going to find a whole lot of surprises with the story, but the game does some fun stuff with itself, despite the straightforward and troporific plot, and the dialogue occasionally does show some fun character in the game's NPCs, which helps to balance out the fact that your main character is mute, and both Milo and Pyra lose their voice when they join you for a good long while. The music's good, the art and character design has a lot of charm to it. This is definitely not a game that would convince you to get into the genre if you're not already a fan, and I would recommend newcomers approach with some form of map or guide if you really want to enjoy your first run-through. But even if you are going in blind, I do think the game is more than worth checking out, so long as you have a good sense of direction or a way to keep track of where you're going. And if you're interested in getting it for yourself, well, that's actually pretty easy. The game is included in almost every modern Genesis collection that Sega publishes, it's on Steam for like 99 cents, and even getting a physical cart isn't too stressful for your wallet. Most copies seem to be going for around $25 or so, which is more than I typically like to pay for a single retro game, but there are also other copies that are being sold in decent condition for less now and then, so it's not really hard to find. The point is, you actually have a lot of options for playing this one fairly easily if for some reason you don't want to fire up an emulator. Of course, this was just the first in a very long series of games that would dabble in many, many different genres of RPG, but it's one of only 2 in the series, I think, to be a dungeon crawler. After this, they'd immediately change tactics to, a tactical RPG. So next time we take a look at the Shining series, whenever that is, we're going to take a look at Shining Force and see how that carried on the series after what was originally supposed to be a super budgeted one-off. See you next time, everyone.